Hello. This video is on one of the most seminal literary essays or critical essays of the 20th century, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, T.S. Eliot's Tradition and the Individual Talent. I will try to bring in some new insights into this essay in this video. It was sometime in September 1919 that T.S. Eliot, a 30-year-old clerk at the Lloyd's Bank in London, wrote his manifesto as a poet and critic. And this is called Tradition and the Individual Talent. Eliot is in his early phase of his career at this time, and he is yet to write his most important books like The Wasteland and the later poems. The essay appeared in 2 installments in the September and December issues of the London little magazine, The Egoist. Eliot himself had been the assistant editor of The Egoist since June 1970. And these 2 issues, September and December issues, were the last that the magazine would publish. The magazine ended with it. The editor, Harriet Shaw Weaver, then turned to publishing books. Initially, only a few critics and writers took note of Eliot's essay, but eventually the essay was recognized as the most influential essay of the 20th century. As I told you, in 1919, when Eliot wrote this essay, he had only produced a very thin volume of poems and just a few essays and reviews. But he was aware of his role in tradition, I suppose, because at this time he had written to his mother. I will quote Eliot, "I really think that I have far more influence on English letters than any other American has ever had, unless it be Henry James." Unquote. Indeed, Tradition and the Individual Talent has the voice of a young man who has just realized his authority and his role in tradition. Now, why is this essay so important? It is not an easy essay to understand, and it presents a conservative view towards literature and tradition. Eliot had proclaimed that he is a conservative. And this is an essay which we can regard as the pronouncement of the death of Romanticism. The essay declares that Romanticism is dead and that modernism, Eliot doesn't name it, Eliot doesn't call it modernism, but the modern approach to tradition, literature, society has succeeded Romanticism and replaced Romanticism. This essay announces it. In other words, the essay goes against the convention of early 20th century criticism, particularly Romanticism, at which time biographical criticism was also common. The essay kind of displaces the author or the poet or the human being from the text. The individual talent is getting meaning only from an understanding of tradition, from an understanding of the individual poet's role in tradition. Alone, by himself or herself, the modern poet does not have significance. And he also famously talks about the impersonality theory, where the personality, neither the personality nor the emotions of the poet has any significance. Emotion as against feeling. Eliot is joined by the other modernists like James Joyce, Ezra Pound, and the new critics in advocating the same ideas of tradition and impersonality. The new critics and the modernists generally believed that tradition of Western literature and culture, starting from Homer, is very significant, and it is a continuum. The individual poet is born into it, but tradition is not something you automatically acquire by being born into it. Like in India, we acquire religion. It is not like that. Eliot defines tradition. Eliot defines the individual poet's relation to tradition. What is meant by tradition? What is it to mean that you have a historical sense? He has a very dynamic concept of tradition, where not only does tradition influence the individual poet, the individual poet also influences tradition. Here in this essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, he is almost like speaking about tradition versus the individual talent. And he is supporting tradition, which he believes is unsupported at this time. That is how the essay begins. The essay begins by Eliot's statement that tradition is unsupported at this time. We will come to all that later. Let me just introduce the context to you first. I have been talking too much about the essay already without going into the context at all. The early 20th century was a time of massive changes in the European society. Because of the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, because of Darwinism, there were massive transformations. The coming of the towns or urbanity, where the people did not really belong. They were wanderers in the city. The coming of war. The First World War had just ended when Eliot is writing this essay. The modernity also brought with it individualism and self-centeredness, which Eliot critiques in The Wasteland that he wrote later. How the self-centered urban man is a failure. That is what he showed in his first major poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. He showed how the mechanization of the society and the mechanization of individual relationships destroy values, destroy spirituality and meaning. The competition of this modern society, the materialism, is all against deeper experiences of life. So literature became reflective of a society that is increasingly disillusioned with the pace of urban and technological growth. Even though Industrial Revolution brought a lot of money and colonialism also brought wealth into the nation, the writers are disillusioned. They are disillusioned with the pace at which cities are growing, the pace at which technology is growing. They are disillusioned with the decline of religion and spirituality and a breakdown of the old world order. Literary movements like symbolism or avant-garde movements or modernism or aesthetic movements, art for art's sake movements, all these movements sought new ways of representing reality, not only in literature, but also in criticism, Russian formalism at this time, sought a new relationship with reality. The writers resorted to experimentation depiction of the absurdity of life and human condition. The absurd theatre is yet to come decades later. But in modernist literature like The Wasteland, you can see the representation of absurdity. Formalism, importance given to form. Because content is so degenerate. The content or the society, reality as it is experienced is so degenerate that they turned to form. The avant-garde movements experimented and rejected established conventions. So they had a contradictory approach to the past. The modernists had an ambivalent or contradictory approach to the past. That is explained in T.S. Eliot's essay Tradition and the Individual Talent. And that is why this essay is so important. Because in the time of modernism, the immediate past or society is lying in shards, in debris. Everything has been broken up. Nothing has any value anymore. And in a desperate attempt to search among the debris of the past for anything that is valuable, Eliot and the modernists are reaching back to what they considered real tradition. Eliot famously says that everything in the tradition is not valuable. You have to consciously choose what is valuable. So, the modernism involved a break with the past or a new relationship with the past. They wanted to forge a new relationship with the past. Ezra Pound famously said, "Make it new. We don't want the past. Make it new." But that doesn't mean they reject the past entirely. There is also an invocation of the past in modernism, as you can see in the mythical method employed by James Joyce in Ulysses. In a review of Ulysses, T.S. Eliot famously said that the modernist writer should employ the mythical method in order to give a shape and a significance to the immense panorama of futility and anarchy that is contemporary history. The modernist writer should give a shape and a significance by using the mythical method. How will he give a shape and a significance to this immense panorama of futility and anarchy? Everything is futile, anarchic in these times. The modernist writer wants to bring order using the mythical method. Now, let me give you an introduction to the essay. The essay is written in 1919. That is in the early career of Eliot. It was first published anonymously in the London magazine, The Egoist. Anonymously, in 2 parts. The essay has 3 parts actually. The last part is a small conclusion. In September 1919 came the first part, December, the second part. It was later republished in the 1920 collection of essays of T.S. Eliot called The Sacred Wood. Eliot's reputation as a significant figure started to grow with the publication of The Sacred Wood. And his greatest work and his fame, real fame, was to come only a couple of years later with the publication of The Wasteland. At this time, Eliot, Joyce, Pound were all writing, and all their works began to be increasingly entrenched in the past traditions of the West. And in their writing, these modernists effected a blending of the old and the new. This is suggested by T.S. Eliot in this essay. A sense of tradition is a blending of the old and the new. It's a sense of the timeless and the temporal, and the timeless and the temporal together. The modernists were aware of their debt to the past. They assimilated past literature into their own, starting from Homer and Dante, down to the symbolists Laforge, Baudelaire. And the modernist works increasingly became disjointed and deeply elusive and intertextual. This essay tradition and the individual talent should also be seen as part of a tradition. The idea of impersonality, the idea that what is important is tradition, not the individual talent, and the poet should not put his personality into the poem, that was there already in the Romantic period to some extent. It was there in Keats and Walter Pater, both were Romantics. And later, after Eliot, you can see this idea full-fledged in, as you know, Roland Barthes. In Roland Barthes, there is the pronouncement that the author is dead. So the essay is also part of a tradition. And very important to the tradition of the essay is the contemporary movement of new criticism. Eliot was, to start with, a new critic. And this essay contributed majorly to the development of new criticism. In new criticism, there is a focus on aesthetic and stylistic elements of poetry rather than ideological and biographical elements, which is what Eliot also advocates. The essay tradition and the individual talent is divided into 3 sections, as I told you already. The first section is about the concept of tradition. The second section about the process of depersonalization and its relation to the sense of tradition. Depersonalization is the term for impersonality. And lastly, there is a conclusion. Now, we will have to read the essay completely. In English writing, we seldom speak of tradition, though we occasionally apply its name in deploring its absence. The English people do not talk much about tradition at that time, but we often talk about the absence of tradition. We cannot refer to the tradition or to a tradition. At the most, we employ the adjective in saying that the poetry of so-and-so is traditional or even too traditional. When we say somebody's poetry is too traditional, what we mean is it is too old-fashioned. It depends too much on cliched plots and an easy style. Eliot is using the word tradition in a more historical and objective sense. He is redefining the word tradition. He says, seldom perhaps does the word appear except in a phrase of censure. Except in criticizing somebody, we don't use the word tradition. Yes, wow, he is traditional. That we don't say. It is as if tradition is a bad thing. If otherwise, it is vaguely approbative. Approbative means praising. If at all we use it in a praising manner, with the implication as to the work approved of some pleasing archaeological reconstruction. It will be about some very old work, archaeological suggestion will be there in the use of the word tradition as praise. You can hardly make the word agreeable to English ears without this comfortable reference to the reassuring signs of archaeology. He is subtly funny when he talks about these ideas. In all his critical works, Eliot is subtly funny. Certainly, the word is not likely to appear in our appreciations of living or dead writers. He says, certainly we won't use the word tradition in our appreciation of living or dead writers. Every nation, every race has not only its own creative, but its own critical turn of mind. Everybody, every society has its own creativity as well as criticism, and is even more oblivious of the shortcomings and limitations of its critical habits than of those of its creative genius. While every society gives importance and that pays attention to the creative writers, people are usually unaware of the critics. For example, in India, we know about Indian English literature. We talk about Indian English literature. But we are not so much aware of Indian criticism, is it? So we know, or think we know, from the enormous mass of critical writing that has appeared in the French language, the critical method or habit of the French. He is saying that at that time, French were known more for criticism than the English were. Eliot is saying that we think we know the French critics. We only conclude, we are such unconscious people, he's talking about the English, that the French are more critical than we. And sometimes even plume ourselves a little with the facts. We even feel proud that the French are more critical than we. He is making fun of the English, as if the French were the less spontaneous. We English are more spontaneous. We are not critical. The French are too critical. Like that, the English people think. Perhaps they are. But we might remind ourselves that criticism is as inevitable as breathing. Very important. Criticism is as inevitable as breathing, and that we should be none the worse for articulating what passes in our minds when we read a book and feel an emotion about it. When we read a book and feel criticism, when we want to criticize a book, we don't feel any worse for it. It is good for criticizing our own minds in their work of criticism. Criticism is not about the book, it is also about us. We should proudly engage in criticism. One of the facts, did you notice that I have put drop cap wherever the paragraphs are beginning? One of the facts that might come to light in this process is our tendency to insist, when we praise a poet, upon those aspects of his work in which he least resembles anyone else. Now, Eliot is pointing out that we expect the poet to be individualistic. When we praise a poet, we point out those aspects of his work in which he is individualistic and does not resemble any past writer. Wherever it appears that an individual modern poet is rejecting tradition or not following tradition, then we are happy with him. In these aspects or parts of his work, we pretend to find what is individual. Look at the loaded way in which Eliot is writing. We pretend to find. In whatever appears to be the individualistic part of his work, we pretend to find what is individual. What is the peculiar essence of the man? We think that to be away from tradition, to be untouched by tradition is good. We think that the essence of the man lies in being individualistic. We dwell with satisfaction. We have to remember this. These lines are important. We dwell with satisfaction upon the poet's difference from his predecessors. Wherever the poet strikes a new chord and is different from his past writers, we are happy with that element. We dwell with satisfaction upon the poet's difference from his predecessors, especially his immediate predecessors. We endeavor to find something that can be isolated in order to be enjoyed. We want the writer to be individualistic. Imagine two actors. Father and son, both are actors. Father is the greater actor, more famous actor. Son is coming up. If the son emulates the father's acting, if the son acts like the father, imitates the father, we are not happy. We want the son to be individualistic. We don't want the son to learn from his father. If the son is different and untouched by the father's influence, then we'll think, wow, that is good. That is what Eliot means. Eliot says that is unnecessary. We are inevitably part of tradition. We are influenced by tradition. Tradition will show in the most individualistic part of our work. Even when it looks like we are different from tradition, it is actually tradition that makes us so. So, I'm reading once more from the essay. Whereas, if we approach a poet without this prejudice, we shall often find that not only the best, but the most individual parts of his work may be those in which the dead poets, his ancestors, assert their immortality most vigorously. Very famous line. If we approach the poet without the prejudice that he should be individualistic, then we will find that not only the best, but even the most individual parts of his work, wherever he seems to be individualistic and not touched by tradition, those parts also, maybe, though we will find that those parts also are where the dead poets or his ancestors assert their immortality. Once again, taking the example of father and son, don't be prejudiced with the feeling that the son should be uninfluenced by his father. Let the son be influenced. If you approach the son without that prejudice, you will understand that in the most individual parts of that son's acting, the father is actually asserting his influence. It is the father or the predecessor that makes the son what he is. So, the modern poets, even when they appear individualistic, they are actually asserting the immortality of their predecessor, even in their most individualistic writing. T.S. Eliot's Wastelands appears like a new kind of poem. Never before anybody wrote like this. Wow, so individualistic, so new, so untouched by tradition. Some people might think. That is not true. The Wasteland is so steeped in traditions. The Wasteland is full of the past. The Wasteland is the past. You cannot write a great individualistic modern poem without being entrenched in tradition. And Eliot says, and I do not mean the impressionable period of adolescence. I don't mean the impressionable period of adolescence when a modern poet is learning to write, but the full period of maturity, the period of full maturity, that is what he means. Even in the most mature parts of the poet, you will only see the tradition asserting its immortality. Right? Now, next paragraph. Yet, if only the form of tradition of handing down consisted in following the ways of the immediate generation before us in a blind or timid adherence to its successes, then tradition should be positively discouraged. That means what? If by tradition I mean an imitation, if tradition just means handing down from the predecessor to the new poet, if tradition only means the new poet imitating the predecessor, then if tradition means only a blind or timid adherence to the past, then tradition should be discouraged. That kind of tradition is no good. We have seen many such simple currents too soon lost in the sand. Wherever new trends emerged, new poets emerged, who simply imitated the past without any novelty, without adding anything, without contributing to it, simply imitating the past. Wherever new poets did that, we have seen those new poets and those trends soon lost in the sands. And Eliot says, very important, this also you must mark, novelty is better than repetition. Simple repetition, that is what he is against. Blind or timid adherence means repetition. That should be discouraged. But novelty should not be forfeited. Novelty should not be given up. Novelty is necessary. Without novelty, you can't be a great poet. So, tradition is not about poets copying past traditions. Precisely, tradition is its opposite. Tradition means that good individual poets should bring something new into the world. Individual poets should bring something new into the world. How to do that? An individual poet will be able to assert his position in the world. He will be able to add something new, bring novelty only by knowing the past. To do this, the poet has to know what is new and different and how it can be positioned within tradition. He should have a historical sense. So, what is important is not what is unique in the poet. What is important is not what is unique in the poet. The unique in the poet is inextricably connected to his sense of tradition. What is important is what he shares with the dead poets or his ancestors, and how his novelty relates to the ancestors. Tradition is a matter of much wider significance. I told you already that Eliot's concept of tradition is historical and objective. Tradition is a matter of much wider significance. It cannot be inherited, and if you want it, you must obtain it by great labor. By being born into a culture or tradition, you don't acquire tradition. You have to identify which of the past writers are important to you. You should identify where you stand in tradition. Take, for example, T.S. Eliot himself. T.S. Eliot has a lot of past writers before him. The Victorian poets like Browning and Tennyson. The romantics like Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, Keats. Before that, the metaphysical poets, Milton, or even Dryden, the Restoration period, Shakespeare. All these poets do not become the tradition for T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot is a modernist. In the modernist period, there are certain peculiar aspects of the society and life. As a modernist poet living in the early 20th century, Eliot is aware of the malady of modern civilization, the evils of modern civilization, the ills of modern civilization. Eliot should consciously, through hard work, forge a sense of tradition by choosing only those poets from the past who are relevant to him and his modern period. That is John Donne and the metaphysical poets. Eliot does not regard Tennyson or Browning or Wordsworth as part of his tradition. He is choosing those writers from the past who are relevant in his present. So, for Eliot, a sense of tradition means understanding the present, understanding the past, and understanding the relevance of the past in the present. Did you understand? Once more, for Eliot, tradition means understanding the present. He should understand the modern society. It also means understanding the past. He should know all the past writers through hard work. And also understanding the presence of the past. Not only the pastness of the past, but also its presence. That means understanding the relevance of the past in the present. Which of the past writers are relevant in the present? He should understand. The individual poet should understand. So, I will explain that. It involves, in the first place, the historical sense. It involves, in the first place, the historical sense, which we may call nearly indispensable to anyone who would continue to be a poet beyond his 25th year. Again, he is joking. Till 25 years, poets are immature. After that, a poet should be mature. He should have historical sense. Historical sense means you should share the best of the dead poets or ancestors. We said that already. The individual poet should share the best aspects of the past writers. How? By having a historical sense of tradition. The poets, individual poets, should have a historical sense of tradition, which is going to explain after this. And after 25 years, every poet should have this, he's saying. And the historical sense involves a perception, not only of the pastness of the past, but of its presence. This is Eliot's dynamic view of tradition. See, you should understand not only your present time, you should also understand the past time, and not only that, you should understand the pastness of the past. Past is dead and gone. Okay, these writers were there in the past, they are dead and gone. That is not what you should understand. You should understand the presence of the past. How the past is relevant today. What does that mean? Each work of art is a trans-historical system. Across history it exists. When you write a poem now, that doesn't mean your poem belongs to the present time. The Wasteland was written in the 1919-22 period. That is not the period in which the Wasteland is existing. The Wasteland is existing from the time of Homer. Each work of art is a trans-historical system, bringing in the whole of literature. From Homer, everything in the past, not everything, whatever is relevant in the past, the literary work will bring to you. The Wasteland is not just the Wasteland. The Wasteland is also Homer. The Wasteland is also Greek mythology. The Wasteland is also Shakespeare. The Wasteland is Milton. The Wasteland is French symbolism. So, no work of art is existing in isolation. Every work of art is a trans-historical system bringing in the entirety of literature. A poet's individuality lies in the ways in which he embodies the immortality of his poetic ancestors. How the individual poet embodies the past writers. How the individual poet embraces and embodies the immortality of the past traditions. That is what makes an individual poet a great poet. The historical sense compels a man to write not merely with his own generation in his bones. It is not enough if you know the present. It is not enough if you know just the present. You should have not only your generation in your bones, but with a feeling that the whole of the literature of Europe from Homer, and within it the whole of the literature of his country, has a simultaneous existence, mark it, and composes a simultaneous order, mark that also. You should not only, Eliot as a modern poet, should have an understanding not only of the modern society, but he should have an understanding of the whole literature of Europe from Homer. European literature. And also, he should have an understanding of the literature of his own country. And he should place himself within that kind of a tradition. So, when the poet is aware of not only the present, not only the past, but also the presence of the past, that is when he becomes a great poet. So, a historical sense means the individual poet's writing, the modern poet's writing, should have not only a resemblance to traditional works. It should not only emulate or imitate or resemble traditional works, but the modern poem should be an appreciation of the relationship of the past with the present. The modern poem should be an appreciation of the relationship of the past with the present. 2 years later, when Eliot wrote the essay, The Metaphysical Poets, he would illustrate this historical sense. He will show how he is choosing John Donne and metaphysical poets as his ancestors. And he is saying that poets should have an understanding of the whole of European literature, as well as the literature of their own country, because this macro literature and micro literature are all having a simultaneous existence. They compose a simultaneous order. This historical sense, which is a sense of the timeless as well as of the temporal. Timeless means tradition, past. Temporal means contemporary times. And of the timeless and of the temporal together. That means the relevance of the past in the present. It is a paradoxical definition. You should know the past as past, you should know the present as present, and then you should prove that the past exists in the present. Past and present are two opposites, but then they are not opposites. They are coexisting. So that is what makes a writer traditional. The historical sense, which is the timeless, sense of the timeless and of the temporal, and of the timeless and the temporal together. That is what makes the writer traditional. And it is at the same time what makes a writer most acutely conscious of his place in time. You should know where you stand within tradition. You should know your relationship to tradition. That is what you mean by your understanding of contemporaneity. Your understanding of contemporaneity means you know where you stand in tradition. Now we move on. No poet, no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone. That means poets or artists must not be judged in isolation. Poets or artists must not be judged in isolation, but must be understood in comparison and contrast with his ancestors, his or her ancestors. A poet does not have any meaning alone, complete meaning alone. A poet's meaning comes from his relationship with his ancestors. His significance, his appreciation is the appreciation of his relation to the dead poets and artists. The significance of a poet lies in his relation to the dead poets and artists. You cannot value him alone. You must set him for contrast and comparison among the dead. So, your understanding of a poet should be in contrast and comparison with the tradition, with the past writers, his ancestors. I mean this as a principle of aesthetic, not merely historical criticism. Hey, when you compare a present writer with past writers, that is not only as part of historical criticism, but even in principles of aesthetics. Not only in terms of history, but also in terms of style, in terms of form, in terms of aesthetics. Poets should be understood in comparison and contrast with their ancestors. The necessity that he shall conform, that he shall cohere, is not one-sided. What happens when a new work of art is created is something that happens simultaneously to all the works of art which preceded it. I suppose you didn't understand. I'll tell you, it's easy. That the individual writer should conform to tradition. That is not a one-sided thing. The tradition should also conform to the individual writer. You didn't understand. I will explain with a silly example. Take a mother and son, or father and son. Okay, or daughter, father and daughter. The father says to the daughter, you should understand what I'm saying. What I'm saying is right and good for you. Obey what I'm saying. Do what I'm saying. The father tells the daughter. That is traditional. That is how it is always. Fathers will tell, or mothers will tell their sons and daughters what to do, and they have to obey. But in Eliot's time, the daughter is saying, Father, you should also understand me. You should also do what I am saying. You should hear me out also. It is not one-sided that I should always obey you and listen to you. You should listen to me also. Did you understand? That means The influence of the past on the individual writer is not one-sided. The individual writer also alters the past. Again, think of father and daughter or mother and daughter. When the daughter is born, the mother influences the daughter. Isn't it? The mother will teach the daughter. The mother will influence the daughter. But doesn't the daughter influence the mother? The mother's personality, the mother's life changes forever. The order of the mother's life changes forever after the daughter or son is born. Isn't it? Why? Because the child is influencing the mother or father as much as the father or mother influences the child. It is two ways. It is both ways. It was always there like that, but nobody realized it. For the first time, Eliot, in his dynamic concept of tradition, shows that just as the past writers influence the present writer also alters and modifies the past. Easy to understand with Eliot's example. Eliot was influenced by John Donne. Eliot was influenced by John Donne. But didn't Eliot's essay, The Metaphysical Poets, change the image of John Donne forever? Eliot's essay, the Metaphysical Poets, changed John Donne forever. The image of John Donne. We don't understand John Donne as a bad poet who used conceits and far-fetched comparisons. He used a lot of eroticism. What a bad poet. That was how John Donne was thought of before Eliot. After Eliot, we think of John Donne. Wow, what a great writer. In John Donne, the head and the heart mingle. There is unification of sensibility. All that we understand now. As John Donne influenced Eliot, Eliot also changed Donne. So, let me read this again. The necessity that the individual poet, the modern poet shall conform, that he shall cohere, is not one-sided. What happens when a new work of art is created is something that happens simultaneously to all the works of art which preceded it. When one new work of art is created, every other work of art changes. Imagine a train bench. A seat on a train or a park bench. In a train is better. There are 3 people sitting on a bench in the train, okay? Suppose a 4th person comes and joins. When the 4th person comes and joins, not only the position of the 4th person, but the position of all the other 3 people also change, isn't it? They all move a little to accommodate the 4th person. So, when a new work of art is created, when the 4th person comes and sits down, what happens is something that happens simultaneously to all the works of art or people sitting on the bench which preceded it. Did you understand? Did I make it too silly? Okay, let us move on instead of dwelling more on silly things. The existing monuments form an ideal order among themselves. Before a new work of art is produced, there are existing works of art. The existing monuments or works of art form an ideal order among themselves, which is modified. That order is modified by the introduction of the really new work of art among them. When the wasteland, the really new work of art is introduced, the existing order of English literature changed. The romantics who were considered very great poets till then became dim. John Donne, who was considered very bad poet, became praised, became accepted. Like that, the existing order changed with the introduction of the new work of art. The existing order is complete before the new work arrives. Think of the train bench. The existing order is complete before the new work arrives. For order to persist after the supervention of novelty, the whole existing order must be, if ever so slightly, altered. After novelty is introduced, after wasteland is introduced, if order should remain, if there should still be order, then that order must be slightly altered. Otherwise, it won't exist. There will be chaos. If all the three people sitting on the train bench refuse to move, if they try to retain their previous order, then there will be chaos. Somebody will fall from the bench. They have to move, at least even slightly. So, the relations, proportions, values of each work of art toward the whole are readjusted. The understanding of all past works, past traditions change because of the introduction of the new work of art, like Wasteland. And this is conformity between the old and the new. The old and the new both conform. Whoever has approved this idea of order, of the form of European, of English literature, will not find it preposterous that the past should be altered by the present, as much as the present is directed by the past. So, like the great tradition of poetry helps to shape a modern poem, the contemporary poem also changes the way in which we perceive the older poems that shaped it. All the poems that shape the contemporary poem are also changed by the introduction of the contemporary poem. Did you understand? Now there is a joke that I want to share with you. David Lodge, the famous critic, wrote a novel, a campus novel it is, as part of David Lodge trilogy. It is called Small World. In the novel Small World, the protagonist is writing a master's thesis on the influence of T.S. Eliot on Shakespeare. Can you believe it? The influence of T.S. Eliot on Shakespeare. That is the master's thesis that the protagonist of Small World is writing. Amazing. It is satire, of course. So what I was saying is, the order of art is complete before the new work of art is introduced. But the new work modifies the existing order. The existing order has to change at least slightly in order to accommodate the modern work. Now, in a peculiar sense, he will be aware also that he might inevitably be judged by the standards of the past. The new writer will be aware that he will be inevitably judged by the standards of the past. I say judged, not amputated by them, because the great past writers are there. The individual poet should not feel amputated. Imagine a house where there is a grandmother, a mother, and a daughter. Okay? The grandmother and mother are great cooks. When the new daughter, the new cook starts cooking, when the daughter starts cooking, she will invariably bring some novelties into her cooking. She will not just imitate her mother and grandmother. She will add her own style, and she does not need to feel amputated or curtailed. She doesn't have to feel oppressed by the tradition. She can be novel and add to tradition. So, she will definitely be judged by the standards of the past. People will say, oh, this is not as good as what your mother cooks or grandmother cooks. Sometimes they will say. She will be judged, but not amputated by them. Not judged to be as good as or worse or better than the dead. To be as good as the dead or worse than the dead or like that, you should not be judged. The individual poet is different, even though he is completely part of tradition. Certainly not judged by the canons of dead critics. Don't apply dead criticism of the past to contemporary writers. Judged not in the sense of being placed in a hierarchy of being better or worse. When the new writer is writing, don't compare in the sense of saying he is better or worse than the past. What is then judgment? It is a judgment, a comparison in which two things are measured by each other. Not only should be the individual poet be judged, the past should also be judged. That is what Eliot means. Not only is the individual poet judged, the two things are measured by each other. The past is also measured. To conform merely would be for the new work not really to conform at all, because then it would not be new. When a new work comes, when the new daughter starts cooking, to completely imitate the mother and grandmother will not be to conform, because then there is no daughter cooking. It is almost like the mother or grandmother is still continuing to cook. There is no difference. The individual poet should be different, but form part of tradition. The individual poet, he or she should be new. There should be novelty. It should not be blind conformity. Otherwise, the new poet will not be new. And the new poet will not be an artist even. Therefore, it will not be a work of art even. So, you should be part of tradition and retain your novelty. And we do not quite say that the new is more valuable because it fits in. Just because a new poet fits into the tradition, that doesn't mean the new poet is good. That is not the criterion for goodness. Fitting in is definitely a test of its value. Fitting in should be there, but that is not the only thing. A test, it is true, which can only be slowly and cautiously applied. For we are none of us infallible judges of conformity. See, when a new poem comes, when a new novel comes, we are not sure whether it fits in or not. The fitting in will come only slowly. When Ulysses was written, even Virginia Woolf did not like it. Many contemporary great poets and novelists did not like Ulysses, James Joyce's Ulysses, because it was not clear at that time whether this novel is good, whether it will fit in, how far it will fit in. The fitting in should come slowly and cautiously. For none of us, not even Virginia Woolf, is an infallible judge of conformity. Both D.H. Lawrence and Virginia Woolf did not like Ulysses by James Joyce. Because none of us is an infallible judge of conformity. We say it appears to conform and is perhaps individual. Or it appears to be individual and may conform. We are hardly likely to find that it is one and not the other. Okay? To proceed to a more intelligible exposition of the relation of the poet to the past, he can neither take the past as a lump, an indiscriminate bolus. Bolus means lump. Nor can he form himself wholly or one or two private admirations, nor can he form himself wholly upon one preferred period. When you talk about the past, you can't take the entire past as one lump. Everything that went before you, you cannot take. Okay, I like one or two writers in the past. I admire one or two writers. Based on that, you can't act. That doesn't form your tradition. And one period I like before me. Entirely that period I like. That also doesn't form part of your tradition. The first course is inadmissible. To take entire past as one chunk or lump cannot be done. The second, that means admiring a few writers, is an important experience of youth, that is immaturity. The third is a pleasant and highly desirable supplement only. If you like one period, okay, good, but that is not your entire tradition. It is only like a supplement. The poet must be very conscious of the main current, which does not at all flow invariably through the most distinguished reputations. The poet should know what is the main current in tradition, and that may not be always seen in the most distinguished writers. It might be seen in the minor writers also. In writers that people don't like also, there might be a lot of tradition. He must be quite aware of the obvious fact that art never improves, but that the material of art is never quite the same. Art is not changing. What is changing is our perception of art. He must be aware that the mind of Europe, the mind of his own country, a mind which he learns in time to be much more important than his own private mind, is a mind which changes. And that this change is a development which abandons nothing en route, which does not superannuate either Shakespeare or Homer or the rock drawing of the Magdalenian draftsman. What does it mean? European literature or European culture, European tradition is an organic tradition. And it incorporates the European canon. The European mind abandons nothing. All the great writers, all the writers of significance will remain within it forever. The European mind or tradition is changing, but nothing is lost. That this development, refinement perhaps, complication certainly is not, from the point of view of the artist, any improvement. When Shakespeare comes first and then Milton comes, Milton is not an improvement on Shakespeare. After Milton, when Dryden comes, Dryden is not an improvement on Milton. After Dryden, when Wordsworth comes, Wordsworth is not an improvement on Dryden. Perhaps not even an improvement from the point of view of the psychologist, or not to the extent which we imagine, perhaps only in the end, based upon a complication in economics and machinery. What he means is there is no improvement. They are all unique. They are all different and all form part of tradition. But the difference between the present and the past is that the conscious present is an awareness of the past, in a way, and to an extent which the past's awareness of itself cannot show. John Donne was not so much aware of himself as T.S. Eliot is aware of John Donne. The past itself did not have an awareness of itself. It is the conscious present that has an awareness of the past. Clear? Next, very famous line. This is probably the central argument in the whole essay. Someone said, this is a short paragraph, only this much, isolated because of its punch. Someone said, the dead writers are remote from us because we know so much more than they did. Precisely. And they are that which we know. Eliot's humor and incisive irony. Imagine that this I here is tradition. The individual poet is coming here. Okay, the individual poet is coming here. Shakespeare comes here, Donne comes here, Wordsworth comes here, and Eliot comes here. Someone said, Eliot is so much better than the others because Eliot knows so much more than the others. And Eliot says, precisely. Someone said, the dead writers these are dead writers. The dead writers are remote from us because we, that means present writer, Eliot, we know so much more than the dead writers. Eliot says precisely, they are that which we know. What is the knowledge of this man here, Eliot? It is this. It is the past writers that the present writer knows. The present writer does not know anything else but the past writers. And now you can't say that the past writers are less important, the present writer is more important, the present writer has more knowledge. They are that which we know. Imagine this whole thing is tradition and this is individual talent coming at the end. T.S. Eliot is here. T.S. Eliot can't say that he is better than the others because he knows better than the others. Because they are that which we know. Okay? In gaining that knowledge of tradition, T.S. Eliot knows tradition. T.S. Eliot knows past writers. In gaining that knowledge of tradition, the poet engages in a continuous surrender to tradition. That he will say later. He gets this knowledge of tradition. T.S. Eliot gets this knowledge of tradition by continually surrendering to tradition. Now, let me move on. I am alive to a usual objection to what is clearly part of my program for the métier of poetry. Métier means fort, F-O-R-T-E. I will put it in simple language. People object to my conception of poetry. That means Eliot's conception. People object to Eliot's conception of poetry, saying that Eliot's poetry is very erudite. And then Eliot is saying, but if you examine earlier poets, you will see that erudition is part of any school of poetry. The objection is that the doctrine requires a ridiculous amount of erudition or pedantry, a claim which can be rejected by appeal to the lives of poets in any pantheon. Look at the lives of poets in any movement. You will see that they were all learned people. It will be affirmed that much learning deadens or perverts poetic sensibility. It is true that much learning, too much learning is bad. It deadens poetic sensibility. Learning alone does not make poetry. While, however, we persist in believing that a poet ought to know as much as will not encroach upon his necessary receptivity and necessary laziness. Again, he is joking. He is saying that a poet should not have too much knowledge, but a poet should know as much as possible, as much as will not encroach into his poetic sensibilities and receptivity. Some necessary knowledge a poet should have. Did you understand? It is not desirable to confine knowledge to whatever. What is this knowledge? That is what is defining. He is saying knowledge should be organic, it should be wide, it should be natural. Knowledge should not be what can be shaped into examinations. Knowledge should not be what is fashionable in drawing rooms. Knowledge should not be pretentious modes of publicity. That kind of knowledge is bad. But real knowledge is necessary for a poet. And how do you get real knowledge? Some can absorb knowledge. Some just get it naturally. The more tardy must sweat for it. Some others have to do hard work learning. So, examinations, drawing rooms, etc. By that he means what is important is not the knowledge of facts, but a greater, deeper understanding. What is important is a deeper understanding of tradition. Shakespeare acquired more essential history from Plutarch than most men could from the whole British Museum. Shakespeare naturally imbibed history from Plutarch. Even if you study hundreds of books and get hundreds of university degrees, you might still not know enough history as Shakespeare did. Because for Shakespeare, history is not facts. History is an understanding, is an analysis, it is a deep sense of life. What is to be insisted upon is that the poet must develop or procure the consciousness of the past. What should the poet do? The poet must develop the consciousness of the past, and that he should continue to develop this consciousness throughout his career. Not only when you start writing. It is not that you develop a consciousness of the past and then start writing. It is not that. You should do it throughout your career. Acquisition of knowledge is kind of acquisition of wisdom and understanding. It should be wide, natural, lifelong. Doesn't matter in what way you acquire it. It should be lifelong. Next, small paragraph. What happens is a continual surrender of himself. Again, very important, that is why small. What happens is a continual surrender of himself as he is at the moment to something which is more valuable. What is that which is more valuable? Tradition. A continual surrender of the individual poet to tradition. That is what is important. The progress of an artist. Mark this, very important. The progress of an artist is a continual self-sacrifice. A continual extinction of personality. Now he is moving on. This is the end of the first section. Now he is going to move on to the idea of impersonality. The progress of an artist makes progress when he continually makes self-sacrifice. He should sacrifice himself to tradition. He should surrender to tradition. He should extinguish his personality. This idea, as I told you, is against romanticism. Wordsworth's theory of poetry was that poetry is self-expression. But even that romantic idea was critiqued in the Romantic period. Keats famously critiqued Wordsworth's self-expression as the egotistical sublime. Keats critiqued Wordsworth's self-expression in poetry as the egotistical sublime. Keats, on the other hand, advocated negative capability. A poet should be able to be in uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts without an irritable reaching after fact and reason. A poet should not try to put his personality into poetry. He should be absent from poetry. Keats's negative capability is a prototype of impersonality theory. Keats also famously talked about the chameleon poet. He said a poet without identity changes readily and temporarily according to surroundings, like a chameleon. So, the idea of impersonality is already there in the Romantic period, and it continued in Roland Barthes' idea of death of the author. The idea of impersonality continued in Death of the Author. So, Eliot is saying an idea that is also part of tradition. Now, the last paragraph in the first part, there remains to define this process of depersonalization. Depersonalization or extinction of personality is the impersonality theory that he will talk about in the second part. There remains to define this process of depersonalization and its relation to the sense of tradition. It is in this depersonalization that art may be said to approach the condition of science. He says, art will approach the condition of science when there is impersonality in art. This idea of art approaching science is also not novel. Walter Pater, just before Eliot, had famously talked about art. He was a critic of the aesthetic movement. All art constantly aspires to the condition of music. That is a famous quote from Walter Pater. All art constantly aspires to the condition of music. He said that he also advocated depersonalization. Walter Pater said that in depersonalization of art, I'm quoting, art may be said to approach the condition of science. Art may be said to approach the condition of science. Walter Pater said that. At the time, Gustave Flaubert, the French symbolist, also said this. Poetry is an exact I forget what Gustave Flaubert said. Poetry is as exact. Yeah, poetry is as exact as science. He compared poetry to science, especially geometry. I don't remember the exact quote. So Walter Pater, Gustave Flaubert, etc. at this time talked about how poetry approaches science. I therefore invite you to consider, says Eliot at the end of the first section, I therefore invite you to consider as a suggestive analogy the action which takes place when a bit of finely filiated platinum is introduced into a chamber containing oxygen and sulfur dioxide. It is with this cliffhanger, this dramatic suggestion that Eliot ended the September installment of the essay. He says that the reader should consider what will take place when a bit of finely filiated platinum is introduced into a chamber containing oxygen and sulfur dioxide. And using this analogy or conceit of platinum, he will explain the theory of impersonality in the next part of the essay. The next part will be another video.